Good morning, everyone. Welcome. We're up to 10. A lot of familiar names in our attendees already, Lloyd. Up to 14, 15. It's going to be a nice sized turnout today. And as you're seeing, this class is being recorded and will be available for the next 7 days. You'll receive an email tomorrow with a link.
Good.
Lloyd, we have 19 so far. I'm just going to hold off now 30 seconds, give a few more people the time to join. As they enter the room, adjust their volume. And this is Lloyd. This is your second Zoom with us. You had your first in December.
That's right. I don't know that I'm any fonder of it, but I'm grateful for the opportunity.
Oh, well, we're up to 25, so I'm going to 26. So we'll pause for another maybe 30 seconds. We still have people joining us. Nice sized crowd. Now you're practically a Zoom veteran for us now. You have more than one class, so that's good. I do see we have 27 people, so I'll just make a couple announcements and a few reminders for people. This is approximately a 90-minute class, so will not be a break. If you have any questions, please click Q&A on your Zoom toolbar, and Lloyd will pause periodically and to ask if there's any questions, and I will read them out to him. We'll also answer all questions that you may have at the end. So as they come up, just click into Q&A. If you are having any technical issues, go ahead and leave that in the chat, and I can message back and forth with you to make sure we get that resolved. Most issues are easily resolved by leaving the class and come back in and establishing a new connection. Most times it's your broadband. And we also recommend you turn off any other devices that you may have on Wi-Fi, using your Wi-Fi at the same time. So I think we have 27 right now. We probably have some more people join us. But Lloyd, welcome. And if you could, you have a long association with Eckerd College. If you can kind of, for those people that may not have attended one of your classes, either in December on Zoom or in person in the Pelican Room, if you could give a little introduction of yourself, if you could.
All right. Good morning. It's a privilege again to be a part of the OLLI program, where I've been involved for a number of years. I do go back a long way at Eckerd College. I joined in 1979 as the Vice President for Academic Affairs and Dean of Faculty. I was Dean of Faculty at Eckerd for 31 years, retired in 2010, but since then have been engaged with the college in various ways, particularly through my involvement with the OLLI program, which I've always enjoyed. So I love Eckerd. I've been a part of Eckerd for almost 40 years now, and I'm glad to be able to continue. Well, there he is, Jonathan Swift, and we're going to spend some time together in his company this morning. It's the right day. Happy St. Patrick's Day. Jonathan Swift is one of the great figures in Irish history, but he's also one of the great figures in English literature. And I might add, one of the most intriguing and in some ways mysterious figures. We will talk about some things this morning, or I will talk about them, and you may have some questions. But we'll be talking about some things where the answers are yet to be found. People still debate what really happened as a part of Jonathan Swift's life. In many ways, it's paradoxical. He was a great Irish patriot eventually, but he was definitely an Englishman and took great pride in his heritage there. He was a priest and then dean of the most important church in Ireland at the time, St. Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin. But at the same time that he was serving as dean, and very conscientiously, he was carrying on passionate love affairs with two women, one about 10 years younger and the other about 20 years younger. He was a powerful advocate of human rights and took great pride in his role there. And yet at the same time, he was a misanthrope. He had a low opinion of human nature. So it's odd to see these things combined in him. He was a gifted poet, not as great a poet as Alexander Pope or John Dryden, who were roughly his contemporaries, but he was a poet of significance, whereas his greatest strength was as a satirist. And many argue that he is the greatest satiric writer in English literature. Jonathan Swift was born in the heart of Dublin, in a little square that no longer exists, in fact, November 30th, 1667. Although he was born in the heart of Dublin, his parents were English. John Swift and Abigail Swift had left England and moved across the Irish Sea to Ireland, where they hoped to improve their economic situation. They were also among many who were encouraged by the British government to move from England to Ireland in order to increase the Protestant and Church of England presence in that country, which was, of course, predominantly Catholic. They were sent there to settle and to gradually, in fact, take largely economic control of Ireland. Unfortunately, Jonathan Swift's father died in Jonathan's infancy, and his mother struggled to maintain an economic situation. Fortunately, several of John Swift's brothers had moved from England with him, and two of them in particular took economic responsibility for the widow and for the child Jonathan. They provided him with a good education at what was called Kilkenny College, a school for children, and then supported his attending Trinity University. Trinity University had been established in Ireland to train priests or ministers in the Church of England. The curriculum was narrow, and it's interesting that we know Jonathan Swift's grade when he graduated. He got an excellent, or as we would say today, an A in Latin and in Greek. But he got indifferent, or what we might call a C+ in theology, and he got a poor, or we might say a D, in philosophy. But in any case, he was intelligent enough to complete his degree and receive ordination as a priest. What was to happen next? Next, his mother moved back to England, and he, in search of a position, used her influence to get an appointment with a retired diplomat in Britain, Sir William Temple. Sir William Temple had an estate at Moor Park, and he had there not only his sister, but his friend's sister there as companions. And the friend's sister had a daughter named Esther Johnson. And Esther Johnson became Jonathan Swift's pupil. He was hired by Sir William to be his personal secretary, but also to tutor this child. We're told that at the time they first met, she was only 9 years old, really a little girl, but as she grew older, she turned into a very beautiful woman, famous for her raven black hair. And I think there's a portrait of her that Chris Conrad could put up. There is the beautiful Esther Johnson. Eventually, Swift got an appointment as a priest, but it was an appointment in Ireland. And it was an appointment in the north of Ireland, where the Presbyterians or Puritans or dissenters were the predominant population. And he himself was, of course, a priest in the Church of England, and he found himself isolated with a tiny congregation and a hostile neighborhood. And after only a year, he went back to Sir William Temple's home at Moore Park, where he resumed his relationship with Esther Johnson, and also continued to serve as Sir William's secretary. As his secretary, he not only monitored his correspondence, he was also commissioned to write Sir William's memoirs. Sir William had been a distinguished diplomat, had served a long time in Holland, where he had become the friend of William of Orange, who was to eventually become Britain's king. So he had important connections, but he has also lived a somewhat ethically loose life, let's say. And so the memoirs included some incidents in his life that his wife was not happy to see prepared for publication. Eventually, Swift decided to go back to Ireland. He went back because he got a better clerical appointment as what was called a prebend, Prebend, a prebend in the Cathedral of St. Patrick. Every cathedral has prebends. These are ordained priests who assist with the preaching and with the other responsibilities in the cathedral. In addition to being a prebend associated with the cathedral, Swift also got an appointment to a parish, Larricourt, where close to Dublin, where he occasionally went out to do additional preaching and service. Swift found that he missed Esther Johnson, 10 years younger than he, but by now a polished young woman of about 20 years of age. And Swift persuaded her and her close friend, a woman named Rebecca Dingley, who was a little older, to join him in Dublin, to move there. He argued that the cost of living would be less there and they could get out of the somewhat restricted atmosphere of the Temple home. And so they moved to be close to Swift in Dublin. We don't know exactly where they lived. There is a location which is referred to as Esther Johnson's cottage, but it may or may not have been her actual place of residence. But in any case, we know that it was fairly close to the cathedral, and that made it possible for Swift and Esther to see each other regularly. It's interesting that Esther and Rebecca were always seen in public together. Esther was never seen publicly alone with Swift. And the device here seems to have been to protect Esther Johnson and to protect Swift from gossip that they were a pair, although there was gossip that they were indeed a pair. But it's interesting that the device to protect themselves was to arrange for Rebecca to live with her and to always be present whenever they were out in public. Swift may have married Esther at this point after she had moved to be close to him there in Dublin. Close friends say that they did get married when Swift was getting close to 50 and Esther was in her 30s. And I'll come back to that in a few moments. Swift gradually earned a good reputation as a preacher, as a faithful prebend, and also as an effective public speaker, so that the Irish clergy of the Church of England appointed Swift to go to London and there to represent them in their efforts to have the British government repeal what was called first fruits. First fruits was in fact a tax that the British government imposed on the Church of England clergy stationed in Ireland. The tax was that whenever they received a new appointment, they were to donate the first year's wages to the government, and that thereafter they were to contribute 1/20 of whatever their income was to the government. The clergy in Ireland were poor as it was, and this tax was onerous. And so they sent Swift, knowing his ties with Sir William Temple and other important people in London during his upbringing, to lead a protest to have the first fruits repealed. The Whig government in power at the time finally responded to Swift by saying, we're willing to remit the first fruits tax if the government will repeal the Test Act. The Test Act was the law that anyone who held a public office in Britain had to attend the Church of England worship and take communion at least once a year as a sign of their loyalty to the church and to the government. The Irish clergy were not willing to support that. Swift particularly strongly supported the Test Act because he believed that loyalty to the state church was an important key to political stability. And it was during this period, in his 30s and early 40s, when Swift is leading the campaign to try to repeal the first fruits, that he published his first, and really you could say his first of only two books that he published during his lifetime. It bears an odd title, Tale of a Tub, written when he was about 40 years old. The Tale of a Tub refers to an odd tale or legend that whalers, when trying to distract a whale from attacking a ship, will cast a barrel or a tub into the waves to try to distract the whale. But the idea was that the tub was a distraction. It was simply an empty wooden barrel of no real significance. And Swift picks up on this metaphor of the tub to write this book, which contains a whole host of satirical attacks on religious and political ideas. The central theme of the Tale of a Tub is a story about a father who we might say would represent God, gives his three sons each a coat. One of the sons, the oldest, is named Peter, and he represents Roman Catholicism. The second son is Martin, an allusion to Martin Luther, but in fact, the one who represents the middle way, the Church of England way. And then the third and youngest son is Jack, a reference to John Calvin, who represents the dissenters, that is, those who were Christian, but who protested not only Catholicism, but refused the liturgy of the Church of England. The three sons take the coats that they're given. The coat could be said to represent the New Testament, the Bible. And Peter decorates his coat with all kinds of extra fancy, ridiculous things. And this, of course, is a satirical attack on the Catholic Church and its elaborate liturgies and unscriptural beliefs from Swift's point of view. Martin is careful to protect his coat. He doesn't decorate it with stuff, but he doesn't try to harm it in any way either. And so he represents the middle way. Jack, on the other hand, rips the coat up, just practically destroys it because of all he strips away from it. And this, of course, is a reference to the dissenters. The book is filled with satirical references to religion. Swift makes fun of predestination. He has a priest who repeatedly walks into a lamppost and always says that that was his destiny. And he argues that the most religious people are the most amorous, whose passion for the opposite sex is also a passion for religious belief. The Tale of a Tub may not sound terribly interesting to us, and I have to say it is somewhat heavy going, although there are some wonderfully funny parts in it. But it was a great success. it went through a series of 6 editions in 5 years. And The Tale of a Tub, which in a sense is Swift's debut as a satirical writer, revealed 2 things: that he has great peculiar power for satire, for making fun of things, even the most serious things, by pretending to praise them. But A Tale of a Tub not only brought Swift fame, not much in the way of wealth, but it certainly brought him prominence and fame. It had another consequence. It seriously, one could even argue permanently, damaged his career. His mockery of religious belief was taken as completely unsuitable for someone who would hold a highly responsible person in the church. Swift was ambitious, and he hoped to become a bishop. But in fact, he never did become a bishop because the monarchs were never willing to give such a position to The Tale of a Tub. It's interesting that after that final edition came out after 5 years, that Swift wrote and added to A Tale of a Tub an apology. And I think it's worth reading what he had to say. "I would forfeit my life if any one opinion can be fairly deduced from that book, which is contrary to religion or morality." Well, there were lots of people who could make that deduction, but Swift insisted that it wasn't really possible. And he wrote a little poem to go with it. "Humor and mirth had place in all he writ. He reconciled divinity with wit." Well, it's true. Swift was skillful at uniting divinity with wit, and he was famous for his witty conversation. But his satire also carried him in such fierce directions that he offended many traditional religious people. Swift knew, because of his failure over several years to get the Whig government in Britain to remit the first fruits, that he was going to have to look to the Tory party for success. The Tory leadership was in fact pleased by this, and its 2 leaders, Henry Bolingbroke and James Harley, hired Swift to write and edit a series of pamphlets entitled The Examiner. Because of his services as this Tory propagandist, he succeeded finally in getting an important ecclesiastical appointment, although it was not as bishop. The Tories had managed to overcome the Whigs because they opposed the long war of the Spanish Succession that the British had waged, basically against France and Louis XIV. They won famous victories in that war under the leadership of the Duke of Marlborough. But they also insisted on retaining the Test Act, the requirement that one be really a participant in the Church of England in order to hold public office. And here they enjoyed the support of Jonathan Swift, because in spite of his way of making fun of the church in so many different ways, he firmly believed in the value of the Test Act as a way of ensuring a political and social order in Britain. In 1713, the Tories came to power finally, and what did they do? They remitted the first fruits. Swift's long campaign finally succeeded. And the other thing they did was to arrange for Swift to get an appointment in Ireland as just the prebend, but the dean of St. Patrick's Cathedral, the most important deanship, and in some ways the most important ecclesiastical position in Ireland. And there you see St. Patrick's Cathedral as it stands today. In Swift's time, it looked just like that, except for the fact that it did not have a spire. That was added later. It was also probably at about this time that Swift and Esther Johnson secretly married. We really don't know whether they did or not, and I'll come back to that a little later in this story. But the fact is that they continued their very close relationship, saw each other frequently, and quite probably alone, but never in the way the public knew about, and in public always accompanied by Rebecca Dingley. It was during this time, these years, when Swift was serving the cathedral as prebend and then as a representative of the Irish Church in Britain, and as dean, that he wrote a series of letters to Esther Johnson. And in these letters, he used the name that he had developed to identify her. The name is Stella, of course, a reference to a star. So these letters of Stella, which have survived, give an interesting series of accounts of Swift's work, both in Ireland and when he was, for many months at a time, in England. There were rumors, of course, about this relationship with Stella, but there was also another rumor that started just about the time Swift began to move toward appointment as dean. And when dean entered the church for the first time as dean, someone had posted on the door a poem. Look down, St. Patrick, look, we pray, on this thine own church and steeple. Convert thy dean on this great day, or else God help the people. Now, why would the new dean be greeted with a poem like that? Well, the story goes that while Swift was in England many months at a time, campaigning for the elimination of the first fruits and writing for the Tory government, that he developed a relationship with the Van Nummery family. It's an unusual way to pronounce a somewhat unusual word, which was in fact in Dutch. I'll see if I can write this on the board. Another Esther. It's pronounced Van Nummery, and I'm not sure I've written it very well up there. Another Esther, Vanhomrigh, pronounced Van Nummery. The Van Nummery family lived close to London, and Swift got acquainted with them because the Van Nummery family had come from Holland, and it was while in Holland that they had become acquainted with Swift's patron. As the days went by, Swift found himself visiting the Van Nummerys more and more. And the reason was they had a daughter, Esther. At the time, she was 19. Swift was 40. So there was 20 years of difference, 10 years difference between Swift and Esther. Stella. And now 20 years difference between Swift and this other Esther. He quickly developed a nickname for her too, a name that has become famous, Vanessa, Vanessa. So there's Vanessa, this young daughter of the Van Nummerys, and he goes to dinner frequently. But as time went by, Vanessa became, and there she is, very beautiful. She became increasingly devoted to this middle-aged priest. And the story goes that she would say to her sister and to her parents, please go downstairs. The Reverend Swift and I need to carry on a private conversation. They also wrote letters to each other, and they wrote notes. And it's interesting how the word coffee came to be almost a signal. Here's Swift writing to her. I wish I were to walk with you 50 times about your garden and then drink your coffee. Here's another. I drank no coffee since I left you, nor intend till I see you again. There is none worth drinking but yours. And finally, I am not cheerful enough to write, for I believe coffee once a week is necessary to do that. So was coffee their code word for lovemaking? It very probably was, although there is no certainty. Meanwhile, all this time, Swift is writing to Stella back in London. giving her these accounts of his activities. He mentions that he's having dinner often with the Van Nummerys, and Stella gets alert enough to raise a question about these dinners and exactly why he's spending so much time there. Swift's answer is that, of course, it's a convenient place to go and have dinner with a family that he admires. He doesn't mention Vanessa. But the rumors grow, and Mary Wortley Montagu, a famous letter writer of the 18th century in England, wrote this little verse about this rumor. So when Vanessa yielded up her charms, the blessed Dean languished in her arms. High on a peg, his unbrushed beaver hung, his vest unbuttoned, and his God unsung. The Tory leaders, Harley and Budding Brooks, were successful in negotiating an end to the war with France. And also, at the same time, began to engage in secret negotiations with James Stuart, known as the Old Pretender, because he was the son of James II and had been living in France and wanted to return as king to England. But the British did not want James to return because they feared that he would reestablish Catholicism as the state religion. And they supported instead the appointment of George I, a German and a Protestant. Swift engages in efforts to moderate Harley's and Buddenbrook's risky negotiations. And in the case of trying to help them moderate their views, he himself comes under suspicion. It's doubtful, very doubtful, that Swift actually was engaged in any sort of what would be viewed as treasonous activity, but there were suspicion. And so he decided to stay in Dublin, to stop continuing to travel across the Irish Sea to Britain to make contact with the Tories and have dinner with the Nummerys and so on. It's also about this time that he and Stella may have married, when the realization was that Swift was not going to be traveling in the same way to Britain. Now, Vanessa, when she realizes that Swift is not coming back to England to visit her, decides to move to Ireland herself. And she does. And she has money of her own through her family. And she sets up a home in a town called Selbridge, close to London. Swift proceeds to visit both regularly. And this goes on for 9 years. And he probably had a sexual relationship with both women although he was very careful to keep them apart and to always keep up this facade of Stella as the companion of Rebecca Dingley, just a good friend, and Vanessa at some distance away in Selbridge. But the story has a sad end, not so much a shocking end as you might expect, because this was, of course, dynamite for the dean of the cathedral to be visiting and probably making love with both of these women. But what happened was that Vanessa's health failed after only a few years. She had tuberculosis. Tuberculosis was in her family. She had had siblings who died of it, and she herself took ill. But before she died, she desperately wanted to find out what the real relationship was with Stella. She wrote Stella a letter and asked Stella if she was really married to Swift. Stella was deeply offended by the letter and showed it to Swift. Swift was furious. We know he was a fine horseman, and he mounted his horse, rode as furiously and fast as he could to Selbridge, walked into Vanessa's room, flung the letter down on the table in front of her, and turned around and walked out. He never saw her again. And she grew increasingly ill, and she died at the age of 36. She left a will because she was a person of means, but she did not include Swift in her will, although we have letters expressing her passionate love for him. Swift was so shaken by this event and her death that he embarked on a 4-month trip, just took off on his own to travel where he had never traveled before, which was away from the Dublin area, out into Western Ireland, where for the first time he had prolonged exposure to the horrible poverty of the Irish people, a poverty that was in many ways the fault of the oppressive British government and the exploitive British landlords, many of whom were absentee. And in any case, in almost all cases, provided very poor support for their tenants. Three years after Vanessa died, Stella fell ill, probably with tuberculosis. Swift's letters refer to the fact of how she had inclined to be plump, but she had become rail thin. And there is Vanessa in her youngest and beautiful days with her famous raven black hair, but now a mere shadow of her original self. There are two versions of the final encounter. Swift came to visit Stella on her deathbed. And one version says that Stella pled with Swift to go ahead and publicly confirm their marriage before she died. In this version, Swift refused. He simply turned his back and walked out of the room. He was heartbroken, but he didn't attend the funeral, couldn't bear to be present. The other version of the story is that Swift visited Stella, but in this case, he said to Stella, let's, at least here at the end, confirm our marriage. And Stella's reply was, no, it's too late. It wouldn't do any good to take that kind of step. And so they died unreconciled, except that Swift did arrange for Stella to be buried in St. Patrick's Cathedral, where he was the dean. We know that Swift was of about average height for the time, 5'6". It may seem short now, but in those days, it was a pretty typical height. He had a high forehead. You can see that in his portrait. He had bushy eyebrows. He had bright blue eyes. People often commented on the intensity of his eyes. And he always wore, except in his very late years, as the picture shows you here, he always wore a wig, a fancy, expensive wig, a periwig. It's the wig that has a part down the middle of the head and then lots of curls off to each side. He had a passion for cleanliness, even into old age. And many of his writings, in fact, refer to the disgusting presence of filth. So he had something of an obsession along this line. He had beautiful teeth, which people admired because, of course, they were relatively rare in those days. But he had a fine set of teeth, and we're told he cared for them carefully with a brush and a quill. He was a person that people enjoyed being with. He enjoyed telling jokes, swapping tales, what he called a bagatelle, which he engaged in with many of his friends. But he could also be a severe preacher with his voice usually raised a pitch, they say, so it was all on the high side, but it would echo through the cathedral, and people always paid careful attention. Someone said Swift's affection for the church was never in doubt, though his Christianity was ever questioned. And I think that communicates something of the mysterious, paradoxical, ambiguous nature of Swift's relationship with the church. But we do know that he always performed his private devotions daily, and indeed did so even until the very end of his life, where his weakness prevented him really from speaking, except for saying the Lord's Prayer, which he did every night. Swift certainly raised enough doubt about religion, and he recognized the inevitability of it. He said doubt is just the inevitability of the God-given gift of reason. But he said there was nothing to feel guilty about doubt, so long as you struggle to overcome it and you didn't try to spread your poison, that was his word, to others. That is, spread false ideas to others. Swift's God, you realize, is a somewhat distant, imperious figure, not the loving daddy. And he had great impatience with what he called fanatics, which were people who claimed to have personal experiences of the deity. He was not a mystic, he was not a pietist, but he did have a really firm belief in God and in God's purposes for mankind, so that his preaching tended to emphasize not theology, but duty and one's responsibilities to the deity. He also believed that the church, supported by the government, is necessary to maintain social order. He had a great fear, as did many in the 18th century, a fear that was to be vindicated by the reign of terror in the French Revolution. He had a great fear of the social anarchy, and he believed that an established church was necessary for social stability. This may seem repressive to us, but it's worthwhile thinking about. That is, can you have a stable society if you don't have fundamental agreement about values? And this is what Swift was all about. For him, what makes this narrow for us is that, of course, Swift equated the consensus about moral values as being located decisively in the Anglican tradition, in the Church of England. Swift believed in liberty of conscience, but it was a liberty of conscience that was not to provoke social and civil unrest. As someone has said, Swift's creed was believe what you like, but don't say so if it's going to contribute to social disorder. It was toward the end of Vanessa and then Stella's life that Swift wrote two of his most important pamphlets, not books, but pamphlets. And these were pamphlets designed to protest England's treatment of Ireland. And they were pamphlets that came out really in connection with his travels to the west of Ireland, where he got his first real prolonged exposure to Irish poverty. The first of these is what's called the Draper's Letters. Swift wrote the Draper's Letters ostensibly anonymously, as written by a draper in London, a draper being a cloth merchant. And this had its own overtones because the British had forbidden the Irish from exporting manufactured cloth. They could send the raw wool to England for processing, but they couldn't sell their own. Swift, in other writings, argued that the Irish should just stop buying British wool and make and use their own. But the Draper's Letters really fastened on another issue. The English government in 1724 authorized a wealthy iron merchant named William Wood to mint thousands of copper coins that could be used in Ireland. That's where they were to be used. The trouble was these coins, for the most part, were not good. They didn't contain the amount of metal that they needed to be worth what they were supposed to be. The British hope was to generate profit by sending cheap money to Ireland to replace dear money. But here, the action touched an Irish nerve and a swift nerve because it tended to cut across and affect all classes. Swift wrote his pamphlet, motivated by fury, to protest this exploitation of Ireland. I'll read you a quote from the Draper's letters. "Were not the people of Ireland born as free as those of England? How have they forfeited their freedom? Are they not subjects of the same king? Does not the same sun shine on them? And have they not the same God for their protector? Am I a free man in England, and do I become a slave in 6 hours by crossing the channel? For in reason, all government without the consent of the people is the very definition of slavery. But in fact, 11 men well armed will certainly subdue one single man in his shirt. But I have done, for those who have used power to cramp liberty have gone so far as to resent even the liberty of complaining, although a man upon the rack was never known to be refused the liberty of roaring as loud as he thought fit. In England, they know nothing about Ireland except that it is full of bogs inhabited by wild Irish papists. And the general opinion is that it were better for England if the whole island were sunk in the sea." Now you can see from the tone of this that Swift here cuts across class lines and religious boundaries. And he identifies with Ireland in these papers as, interestingly, his mother, something he had never really thought about or expressed before. As others have pointed out, it was Swift who first really expressed an Irish national consciousness, especially over against England. The British government offered a substantial reward to have someone identify who the Draper was. There were, of course, widespread suspicions about who it was, but no one knew for sure. Swift, in his poem written late in life entitled Verses on the Death of Dr. Swift, written about himself, described his role this way: "Fair liberty was all his cry. For her he stood prepared to die. For her he boldly stood alone. For her he oft exposed his own. 2 kingdoms, just as faction led, had set a price upon his head, but not a traitor could be found to sell him for 600 pounds. No one did reveal him, and eventually the government canceled Wood's order and withdrew this plan to flood Ireland with cheap money. Swift became a national hero. On his birthday, November the 30th, every year, the church bells in Ireland were rung, bonfires were lit, and there were festive parades. He became known simply as the Dean, as if there were no other. A man named Satire, who had been appointed the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland by the British government, was asked how he governed Ireland. And he said, "I pleased Dr. Swift." Swift's other great pamphlet, and one of his real masterpieces of English prose, was what's called A Modest Proposal. An ad appeared in the London papers, the Dublin papers. The latent apparent spirit of patriotism or love to our country, so abounding of late, has produced a new scheme said in public to be written by D/S/, wherein the author ingenuously advises that 1/4 part of the infants under 2 years old be forthwith fattened, brought to market, and sold for food, reasoning that they will be dainty bits for landlords who, as they have already devoured most of the parents, seem to have the best right to eat up the children. Well, you get a sense there of the fury that now motivated Swift in his attack on the mistreatment of the Irish by the British. Here's another quote. "He has been assured a young, healthy child, well nursed, is at a year old a most delicious, nourishing, and wholesome food, whether stewed, roasted, baked, or boiled, and I make no doubt that it will equally serve in a fricassee or ragout. A child will make 2 dishes as an entertainment for friends. And when the family dines alone, the fore or hind quarter will make a reasonable dish. And seasoned with a little pepper or salt will be very good boiled on the 4th day, especially in winter." This was Swift's response to the gross poverty and degradation of the Irish population. And what he argued was largely the result of British economic policy. A Modest Proposal is, in a way, horrible. It is satire at its strongest and fiercest. But it was really a modest proposal, and the papers of the Draper that gave the Irish, many argue for the first time, this sense of a national identity focused around protest. Swift in this period also produced his second book. The first book, A Tale of a Tub, but now, more than 20 years later, there appears Gulliver's Travels. Gulliver's Travels is a book he had worked on for several years. And when it appeared, it immediately became one of the most famous books in the world. Ironically, it's enjoyed a lot of its fame as a tale for children. But of course, it really isn't. There are portions of it that are not only shocking to children, but would be are shocking to adults. Gulliver's Travels is, in a sense, a part of Swift's protest on behalf of Ireland. But what makes it a great book is the fact that it reaches far wider. It is really a satire on human folly, on the folly in politics, in economics, in religion, in social life, and sexual life. Gulliver, a mariner, ends up taking 4 voyages. The first and most famous is the journey to Lilliput, where he awakens on the beach, entrapped by ropes imposed by little human figures who are to scale in the sense that they are 1/12 of what would be considered normal size. Much of the voyage to Lilliput is a satire on politics, war, over which end of a boiled egg to open. The second is to Brobdingnag, and Brobdingnag is the home of those who are 12 times larger than the typical human beings. And its effect is to emphasize also the pettiness, the smallness, the insignificance of so much of human activity. The third, and probably the least known of these travels, was the travel to Laputa. Laputa is the land where theories replace common sense. One theory, for example, is that human excrement can be turned into nourishing food. And then the fourth journey is to the land of the Houyhnhnms, a word that Swift invents to echo the sound of a horse whinnying. And here, Gulliver finds a land that is divided between the Houyhnhnms, horses, who are admirably rational, and the Yahoos, a term that Swift has really given to us. The Yahoos are, lo and behold, human beings, but they're human beings who live in filth and are vicious and dishonest. He describes them, for example, as digging around in the mud for colored stones, a reference, of course, to the human passion for jewels. The Houyhnhnms themselves are a race of creatures who have no word for lying, no word for the law, no word for government, no word for war, no word for lust. They are eminently rational creatures. Swift began to decline in his 70s. And in fact, by the end of the 1730s, he had pretty much become the victim of what today we think of as Alzheimer's. He had rages. He forgot much, and in fact had difficulty dressing and tending to himself. The sad thing is that he was aware that this was happening. And the story is that one day when he was out for a walk, his companions found him stopped and looking up into the branches of a large elm tree. And when they approached him, he said, "I shall be like that tree. I shall die at the top." While he was still sane enough to do it, he left instructions for his burial in St. Patrick's, and also that his burial be alongside Esther Johnson. So today, while there are very, very few places where you can find any physical traces of Swift's life, you've certainly got St. Patrick's Cathedral, and inside the cathedral in the southwestern corner, you find Swift and Stella's or Esther Johnson's grave. Swift wrote his own elegy, which was placed on his on a wall, in a plaque on a wall in the cathedral. It's in Latin. Hic depositum est corpus Jonathan Swift, huius ecclesiae cathedralis decani. And then there follows 4 other lines. The poet, William Butler Yeats, great Irish poet, composed a translation. Swift has sailed into his rest. Savage indignation there cannot lacerate his breast. Imitate him if you dare, world-sotted traveler. He served human liberty. He served human liberty. Certainly he did serve it in the sense of vigorous protest against folly and against the exploitation of other human beings. And the other phrase that catches the eye is savage indignation that can lacerate his breast. He was a man who was tortured by his impatience with human folly. Well, let's pause here and see what questions you might have in the time we have remaining.
Thank you very much, Lloyd. Very in-depth look at Jonathan Swift. We do have a couple questions, and if anybody else has a question, please type it in the Q&A or the chat. You also can click raise hand and be prepared to unmute your mic. I'm not sure if anyone in our attendees have actually been to St. Patrick's Cathedral. If you want to go ahead and let us know if you have. You mentioned that there were not a lot of. You mentioned he's a national hero, but there were not a lot of identifying places around Ireland with him. I mean, obviously St. Patrick's Cathedral. Are there anything else? I know you mentioned like Esther's house. Maybe she did stay there at one point. Any other landmarks? I guess I'm trying to ask.
Yes, it's an interesting thing about Swift that there are so few places where you can say, here he stood and this is what he did. The part of London where he was most active before he became dean would be completely changed. There aren't any any blue plaques locating this and that and the other place. One thing that's even so obscure is that there's no record in any church of his having been baptized. The closest church to where he was born is an old church called St. Warburg's, but St. Warburg's has no reference to his baptism. And so everybody says he had to have been baptized, but no one can locate the spot, although you'd think that would be a place where there would be a record. And the places in Ireland, Larracour is the little village where he was nominally the priest while he was a prebend in the cathedral. Larracour is there. You can go and visit it, but there are no traces of anywhere he lived or was active, except for a row of willow trees. We're told. I've been to St. Patrick's Cathedral, but I've not been to Larracour, and they say the only thing you can see are a row of willow trees, which he may have planted because he references in his letters. So it's Jonathan Swift really lives on in his writing and his letters and in the testimonies of friends and others. We have Stella's letters, and we have Swift's letters to Stella. Many of her letters were destroyed, and in Vanessa's case, we do have some of her letters and some of his to her. And I haven't done this, but I have been told, I have read that there are those who've actually been there, and that it's quite a thrill to actually hold one of these letters in your hand, because at the time they were so secret.
And still to this day, they ring the church bells on his birthday?
Yes, there's still acknowledgement. I wouldn't say it's as universal as it was in those days. It's certainly not that. But it's certainly a day in Ireland that is recognized as a significant event, because he ended the first fruits tax, and he had them back off the phony coin issuance. And so and of course, Gulliver's Travels, which remains a book that's still widely read, and in Bowdlerized versions read by children. So yes, there's still a sense of his presence on November 30th, but it's not to the same degree of intensity.
We do have 3 questions in the Q&A, and the first one is from Joan, and it is about Gulliver's Travels. She said, "Thank you so much. Would you consider a presentation on Gulliver's Travels in the future?"
Well, that is worth thinking about. I appreciate the suggestion. There have been several Ollie sessions where, in fact, I've picked a book um, and had people encourage people to read it, and then we had a discussion based on it. And this might be a good thing to think about doing. Ask people to read Gulliver's Travels, or at least to read a portion of it, and then have a discussion about it, because there'd be plenty of things to talk about that would still have effect today. The folly of war and other things like that, and the follies of various kinds of human greed.
I'm not sure what day November 30th is in 2021, but it might be a good topical glance.
Oh, that's good. Well, you and your questioner have some wonderful ideas that I'll take under consideration.
Let's see. Since I brought it up, November 30th is a Tuesday, so maybe we can pencil you in for 10:15. Eugene's got a good question. I was along the lines. I was trying to think how I would phrase it, but he does it pretty well. Eugene asks, as far as the history of satire, is Swift considered the father or grandfather of the form? Was satire used before Swift's mastery of it?
Yes, satire has a long history. It can go back to the Greek and Roman classics. But I think Swift's satire in the 18th century, in the period of the Enlightenment, really stood out, because so much of the 18th century's emphasis was on the Enlightenment, on human reason and the need for human reason and human calm and human straightforwardness. Even the architecture stops being so ornate and becomes straightforward. And in a way, Swift is a kind of a throwback to a more uninhibited approach to human communication. I guess that's the way I'd put it. And his language is wonderful. It's so blunt. It's so direct. Swift is not. Sometimes his allusions are hard to follow, but the basic sense of what he's communicating is very simple and very direct. Samuel Johnson, on whom I spoke once earlier, and who was a great 18th century writer and expert on literary critic, said that he didn't care for Swift, but he had to admit that Swift was one of the greatest writers in the English language. So it was a kind of a double-edged compliment. And I think that's still true. I think Swift's reputation still holds up very well among students of literature. And really everybody ought to read, although it's horrible in its way, everybody ought to read A Modest Proposal. I mean, it's not long, and it's one of the great pieces of English prose. The story is that the actor Peter O'Toole read A Modest Proposal publicly in the Abbey Theatre in Dublin to celebrate Irish independence and to celebrate Jonathan Swift. And the crowd was so disgusted that most of them walked out. They left. They couldn't stand to sit there and listen. But here again, it's you want to recognize the power of language, a sort of uninhibited power. You don't need to use any curse words. You don't need to do anything except say what you think are ostensibly nice things about the exploiter, when in fact, of course, you're absolutely decimating them.
And we're almost out of time, and we do have one final question, and the
Sure.
final is from Kay. Were Anglican priests not allowed to marry during that time?
Anglican priests could marry, but it was not something that was looked on with a lot of favor, particularly if you were ambitious for becoming a bishop or becoming a cathedral dean. But yes, you could marry, and many did. And that's part of the mystery of Swift's relationship with Stella. One wild theory is that, in fact, they discovered they were distantly related, that perhaps Stella was the illegitimate daughter of Sir William Temple, and that through Swift's mother, there may have been some distant relation with the Temple family. And it was this discovery that inhibited them from marrying. But there's really no direct evidence for that. That's just one of the kinds of almost crazy speculations that grow up. But it's clear that whatever the reason, Swift felt that marriage was not something he wanted to do. It was not in his interest ecclesiastically. And he had some harsh things to say about family life, so he may have been uneasy about married life. And then there have been those who've argued that Swift didn't really have sexual desire. He just wasn't sexual. But there are letters that don't indicate that. The references to coffee, for example, and some other things, those seem pretty intensely erotic. The amazing thing, to me, is the fact that for 9 years, here's the dean of the cathedral carrying on love affairs simultaneously with a woman 10 years younger and another woman 20 years younger, both absolutely devoted to him, each jealous of the other. How does he bring that off? I don't know.
Well, it is 12:02, so I think it's time to let everyone go and get a head start on our St. Patrick's Day celebrations today. Lloyd, thank you very much. Always entertaining, always nice to see you on Zoom, and great job today. And everyone else.
Thank you very much.
Everyone else, we appreciate you supporting Ali at Eckerd College, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.